Welcome to the Writer-Centered Virtual Craft Chats, where we talk to authors a little bit less about what they wrote and a little bit more about how they wrote it. We are here today with Lilly Dancyger. I am delighted to talk to you about this book, which left me literally when I got to the end. I'm not going to spoiler alert, but the last sentence, I was laughing, crying, goosebumps. It was just absolutely a journey. So thank you. Lilly, hi.
Hi, thank you for having me. Great to be here.
I would love it if everybody who is not Lilly would mute yourselves, except me. Lilly, if you would just read us your choice of a few pages of First Love.
Sure.
So get us in the mood.
I'll just read from the beginning. It's the easiest place to start. Let's see. So I'm going to read from the title essay called First Love. I sent my first love letter when I was 6 years old. My handwriting was blocky and large, requiring great effort and concentration to express this big emotion my little body could barely contain. I made a card shaped like a butterfly, cut out with safety scissors, decorated with elaborate colored pencil patterns, and wrote to my 5-year-old cousin Sabina that being far away from her made me feel like a butterfly with one wing. The grown-ups called us Snow White and Rose Red, after the Grimm's fairy tale about two sisters who match their mother's 2 rose bushes, one that produces white roses and the other red. Though our mothers shared a sisterly resemblance, I had my Jewish father's wild curly hair and pale blue eyes, and Sabina had her Filipino father's warm brown skin and straight black hair, always brushed to a sheen and neatly braided. Dark and light, opposite twins. Snow White and Rose Red, no relation to the Snow White of Disney fame from another Grimm story, is remarkable among fairy tales because the two sisters are not rivals or foils, but simply love each other. The two children were so fond of one another, the story goes, that they always held each other by the hand when they went out together, and when Snow White said, "We will not leave each other," Rose Red answered, "Never, so long as we live." In my earliest memories, before my parents and I moved from New York to San Francisco when I was 5, Sabina was always either by my side or nearby. Sometimes we lived together, and sometimes we just stayed over at each other's apartments a lot. One morning, when I was 4 and Sabina was 3, we woke up before the grown-ups, and she said she was hungry. I could wait for my own breakfast, but I couldn't wait for hers, so I took her hand and led her to the kitchen. I pulled a chair over to the counter, where I climbed up and dug around in the cupboards until I found a salad bowl. When the adults woke up, they found us sitting on the floor, covered in milk, sharing an entire box of soggy cereal. That was always how I felt about Sabina. If she was hungry, I would climb obstacles taller than myself to bring her a whole week's worth of breakfast. Moving 3,000 miles away from her was my first heartbreak. There's a lot of cultural mythology around the idea of a first love, that it stays with you for life, a high you never stop chasing, a magic spell cast on a fairy tale princess, dictating the way the rest of her story will unfold. One theory about why first love makes such an impact is that first experiences with romantic love tend to happen during our teenage years, when everything is heightened by increased hormone levels and when the part of the brain that retains memories is maturing. This is why the music we listen to as teenagers tends to remain emotionally significant throughout our lives, and, in theory, why first teenage love stands out, a yardstick by which to measure every other love that comes after it. But what about the first childhood experience of love, the first person you truly love other than your parents? Does a first sisterly love set the bar for a lifetime of friendships? It's true that I've never been satisfied with friendships that stay on the surface, that my friends are my family, my truest beloveds, each relationship a world of its own. The best compliment I've ever been given was, "You're so many people's best friend." Maybe I've always sought friendships predicated on deep love and knowing, been unwilling to settle for less, because I learned at such a young age that they're possible. Sabina and I told people when we were little, we love each other. And in the way adaptations of speech made by small children so often do, the phrase feels truer than the original. Between us, there was no separate each, only our. This was my first definition of love. I'll stop there.
Take the personal away, Amy. This is your job. Okay, so I just absolutely, as a person with two sisters, I just absolutely beautiful. So, all right, let's start with a standard writer-centered question. Lily, who the heck are you?
I wear many hats. But these days they mostly are all writing related. I teach creative nonfiction at 2 MFA programs and also independently. I'm also a freelance editor, former magazine editor, current small press book editor. So yeah, always playing around with words, mine or somebody else's.
I mean, that's fantastic to be like full-time words.
Yeah. It took a lot. It took a while to get here. I was bartending full time for the first several years that I was trying to build a word castle, but here I am.
Do you miss bartending?
Once in a while for a second, there are things about it that I miss, but mostly no. Mostly I'm glad to be done. I also I don't think I could stay up until 5 in the morning anymore.
As I raised my eyebrows thinking, oh, really, 5 in the morning? I thought last call was like 2. Okay.
It's 4 in New York.
So, there is that whole writing tribe on Twitter of like 5 a.m. writers, just saying.
Yeah.
Okay, so another question before we really dig into your actual book is, we'd like to ask all our authors, is there a question before we start is there a question that you haven't been asked about this book that you want to share? Something you have about your writing practice, something you'd like to speak about that you haven't been asked before?
I don't think so. I was lucky enough to go on a pretty amazing tour and be in conversation with a bunch of really smart, amazing writers, and they all asked me such good questions. I don't think there was anything left at the end that I was like, oh, I never got to talk about whatever. I think mostly though, I tend to prefer writing conversations that really dig into craft as opposed to, I'm happy to evangelize for friendship all day, but it's really the nitty-gritty, nerdy craft stuff that excites me. And I know that's what we're here to talk about. So
that's what, okay. So
yeah.
Okay, so let's start with the book structure. I'm going to hug this. I know I have blur on, so people can't see it, but so let's just talk about for someone who hasn't had the pleasure of yet picking this up, and please buy the book. The link's there. Without giving too much away, can you explain as an essayist how this works?
Yes. Yeah. So there really are 2 main threads of the book as I see it. There's the story of Sabina, my cousin, who I just read a little bit about, who was, the titular first love of my life, my first best friend. And she was murdered when she was 20 and I was 21. And so there's that story threaded throughout. And then there's also the story of kind of coming into who I am through intimate relationships with my closest female friends. From, grade school best friends who grieved the breakup of the Spice Girls together to, my current still best friends of decades now. And those 2 threads are connected and they kind of weave in and out together. And both of those threads kind of originate in this first essay, First Love. there's a kind of loose chronological structure, kind of, to the book. But
Well,
that gets kind of played with. Yeah, go ahead.
so, okay, so how much time does the book cover?
I mean, it spans my whole life up to this point, pretty much, but it doesn't cover, it doesn't cover time evenly. I would say, there's little bits of early childhood and little kind of peeks into the present. The part of it is really like teenage years, I would say, teenage years to early 20s, where so much of that identity formation really happens. And kind of when I was really forming and solidifying those bonds of chosen family with my closest friends. Um, but yeah, I think most of the essays kind of span time and to some extent.
So, okay, so over what period of time, because we're talking craft, over what period of time did you write them? But not so much a temporal question as like getting into, did you know where you were going? How did you
Hmm.
start this process of this book?
I had a general idea of where I was going, but it definitely evolved a lot as I went. The seed of the idea kind of came when I was writing my memoir, Negative Space, which is all about my father, um, both of my parents, but mostly my father, and kind of my upbringing and art and grief. And in writing about my teenage years in that book, there just wasn't a lot of space to go into a ton of detail about all these relationships that were so important to me at the time. Just because that's not what I was there to talk about, in the context of that story. Um, but it was really difficult to write about my teenage life and not talk about this community that was so vital and really kept me alive in that time. So while I was working on that chapter, I kind of had the beginning of the idea that I would write about those relationships somewhere else separately. And I had a similar experience in that book of, wanting to write about Sabina, wanting to write about what happened to her, but realizing that I couldn't include it in that memoir because it just would have sucked all the attention. You can't really just drop a murder into the middle of a story and then keep moving. It would have become part of what the book was about. And so those two kind of seedlings were sitting in the back of my mind while I finished the memoir, and they eventually kind of started to grow together into one thing. And then yeah, it wasn't until Negative Space was like done and getting ready to come out, which was I guess 2020. It came out in 2021. So I think 2020, when I was like waiting for edits and stuff, was when I started actually writing the essays for this book.
So, okay, so you had a direction. So this is kind of a plotter pantser questions for people who don't know what I'm talking about. It's do you know where you're starting? Do you know what your plot is, or do you go by the seat of your pants?
Mhm.
And it sounds as though this was a combination.
Yeah, I mean, I sold it on proposal, which means I had to have at least an idea of where I was going. The proposal included an outline with like a brief description of all the essays I was going to write, um, and kind of a sense of like what the overall thing was going to be. But then once the book was sold and I started writing it, that evolved a lot. I cut a couple of those, I added a bunch more, I rearranged them. So it's recognizable from the proposal for sure. And a lot of those essays that I planned from the beginning are in there. But they're not necessarily in the same order. And there's other stuff that was added. Like there are several like short flash essays throughout the collection, which all those were added kind of late in the process. Those were not part of the proposal. Those were those were an experiment, because once I started writing the essays, I realized I kind of had gotten into a groove where I would just kept writing braided essays. And
Okay, yeah.
I realized that I was kind of writing, I don't know, it started to feel too familiar, too comfortable, which I knew meant it was gonna get stale, for me. And if it was feeling too familiar to me, it was gonna definitely feel too familiar to readers. So I kind of gave myself a couple of assignments of like, shake it up somehow, and one of those was like, all right, try writing a couple that are just straight narrative and don't bring in any research. And then, and they also just kept getting longer and longer and longer. So I was like, okay, what would happen if you tried to write one that was under 1,000 words? And I had never really done that much flash. So in order to do that experiment, I had to kind of do a deep dive into that form. And I read a couple of flash anthologies and took a flash class and really went in on it. And I discovered that it's really, really fun and produced a few pieces that I liked a lot. So I ended up keeping them in there as kind of breathers between some of the longer pieces. So that was definitely an evolution that was not planned from the beginning.
So just so let's as long as we're talking craft. And by the way, if you signed up for my flash class, I'd have a heart attack at seeing your name on the roster. So can you explain for the listeners who may or may not know what a braided essay is, what flash is, and then dig into my question a little bit, because I do want to talk about the braided essay. I love a braided essay. I do. I love a braided essay. But your spines are often these different cultural references. So after you explain what it is, I'd love for you to dig into how you did that. And starting soon, you're welcome to throw your questions in the chat.
Sure. So yeah, I guess I'll start with flash. The simplest definition of flash essay is just that it's a really short essay. By some definitions, it's under 1,000 words. By some, it's under 750. I just went with really short. I think the longest flash one is maybe like 1,100 words, which maybe technically that's not flash, but I still treated it like it was. But the approach for a flash essay is just very different because you don't have a lot of space. You can't go down all these tangents. You can't give all the backstory. You can't get verbose. You really have to just get in there, create a feeling, and get back out. And you can also, I think there's more room to like experiment with form. I have a flash essay that's in a list. I have a flash essay that's a set of instructions. You can do things with form that I think would start to feel gimmicky or annoying in a longer piece, but you can get away with it in a short space. So yeah, that's flash essay. And then braided essays, just an essay that has multiple strands. There's one, yeah, maybe two. There's at least one essay in here that is technically a braided essay, but all still personal, like multiple personal narratives kind of weaving in and out. Most of the time, or a lot of the time, when people talk about braided essays, they're talking about essays that braid like a personal narrative with something external, right? So I have a braided essay about the aesthetics of sadness, where there's a personal narrative about my friend Heather and her depression. And then there's also a strand about Sylvia Plath, and one about Janis Joplin, and one about, the Tumblr and all of that, right? So it's like reaching outward. And yeah, to your question about why all the external stuff. It's a way, I think, to make the collection as a whole and the individual essays feel bigger than me, a way to connect with readers, a way to connect with bigger ideas, a way to just kind of expand. It feels like opening the window and letting air in. But without, I was never interested in writing some kind of like definitive, this is what friendship is, right? And this is what friendship means. It was always important to me that it was going to be just about my own experience. And I'm not trying to speak for anybody else, but bringing in these cultural references and talking about these broader ideas of like, there's an essay in there about the true crime genre and true crime memoir in particular, and I've talked about fairy tales and kind of the science of first loves in that, even just in that little bit of that essay that I read at the beginning. And yeah, I don't know, it just feels like a way to make it larger.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense to me. It's signposts, right? It's hopefully common cultural references, but then you make it deeply, deeply personal. Um, yeah, and there was one movie you referenced, I'm blanking on the name,
Heavenly Creatures, yeah.
right, which I had not seen.
Oh, it's really good. You should watch it.
I will, but I was like, that looks interesting, but the essays stood without my having to see that. So how do you oh, we got fans of the movie in the chat.
Yeah.
So how do you so that's actually really so how do you, so if we're looking at the parts you braid in as an essayist, as a signpost, how do you make it for people who haven't read, heard, listened to whatever you're referring to?
Yeah, that's important. I definitely, I didn't want that essay in particular, and that's a movie where like it has a cult following for sure. There are people who love it, but a lot of people haven't seen it, and so I didn't want to limit the audience.
I wasn't limited. I felt a
Yeah,
little bit like,
exactly. Yeah, so
I want to watch this, but yeah,
yeah, but whenever I'm bringing in anything external, like, I mean, even Sylvia Plath, right? Like, it would be easy to write, I wrote about Ariel, and it would be easy, I think, to go into writing about something so that's like such a cultural touchstone, assuming familiarity on the part of your audience, but I don't ever want to assume familiarity. So even with Ariel, I gave like a one sentence like description of what it is. Even the bell jar, I said what it is, just
right.
always whenever bringing in something like that, just briefly kind of state your terms, define the thing you're talking about. And then I think also being specific in the elements of the external thing that I'm engaging with, and kind of describing those specific elements as I go makes it so you don't have to have seen the movie to understand that I'm talking about, a fantasy world that's depicted in claymation. Okay, you can understand what that means without, rather than just being like the way they depicted the fantasy world in Heavenly Creatures, leaving you to be like, but how? I don't know. I haven't seen it.
Right, but for me, as somebody who rereads, I am a rereader because it makes me want to, I mean, for the references that you referenced, that I know, I got it, but it makes me want to watch the movie and go back and dig in and see the other layers, which feels like to me, a gift, because I consider rereading like visiting old friends. I am going to jump into the craft chat. No, we are in the craft chat. I'm going to jump into the chat window. I have, okay, multiple screens. There goes the mouse. Okay. Okay. So Dave says your book, which sounds wonderful, and it is, buy the book, write the reviews, feels very close to the memoir I'm writing. It has a loose, non-linear spiral structure through the three primary periods in my life that mixes topical chapters with sequential chapters. What are the chief differences between writing your memoir and writing a collection of autobiographical essays? And that was actually a question I sent you earlier, Lily, which is, I have seen reviews of this, which is like, it's kind of a memoir. And I kind of bristle at the whole, like, why do we have to call it anything? But what do you think about this as autobiography in memoirs, having written a memoir? And I'm going to be quiet and let you answer because I think you get it.
Yeah. I actually, I have this, I've been wanting to write this craft essay about the memoir and essays and how nobody really knows what that means, and it can mean whatever we want it to mean. And I think there is a lot of like porosity between those terms, like memoir, essay collection, memoir and essays. But having said that, it's very clear to me that Negative Space is a memoir and this is an essay collection. And they are not the same. You know, I approach them very differently. But I had more than one person mention like the essays in Negative Space, and several people have called this book a memoir. There was a publication that did ran a Q&A with me, and in the headline they called it a memoir, and I was like, you're like a publication that covers books, can you please call the book the genre that it is? You know? So this is not a memoir. And I even said in like the beginning, in like contract negotiations, we were talking about, you know, title being subject to change and whatever, and I was like, sure, we can talk about that, but don't call it a memoir, because I think this would be a very bad memoir. I think it's a decent essay collection, but I think it would not be a good memoir because it doesn't have that overall arc. I mean, it does kind of. If you go looking, you can find an arc, but
I
it's
found
not. It's not one overarching story in the way that that Negative Space is. Even though Negative Space is also braided and, you know, kind of hybrid and whatever. So they felt very different to me, and they're, you know, one of the reasons I wanted to write an essay collection was because figuring out the book length structure of a memoir was such a beast. And I lived inside of that book for 12 years while writing it. And I was like, I need smaller bites. You know, I want to do something different. I want to work on smaller, discrete pieces that I can, you know, finish and then move on from. And that was really freeing, I think. You know, when I got overwhelmed or frustrated or bored with one essay, I could just move on to another one, and it was an entirely separate thing, instead of like with a memoir, yeah, sure, you can jump around and work on different scenes, different sections, whatever, but you're always in the same story. Of course, there were different challenges, you know, then it's like that's kind of a double-edged sword, because it's fun that they're discrete, separate things, but that also means if you're somebody who does a lot of like background reading and research and really has to go down the rabbit hole for each piece, like I am, that means you're doing that. I can't remember how many there are now, 15 times, 12 times instead of once, you know? So, yeah.
So, all right. So I am going to get back to your questions in the chat, but I want to get to so you don't talk about it in the end of First Love as footnotes or endnotes. You talk about it as works consulted.
Mm-hmm.
And as a former lawyer, I found that, you know, with my citations, I found that really interesting. I hadn't seen that before. It might be a thing that I haven't seen, but can you talk about what you mean by works consulted? Because you were just talking about a rabbit hole.
Yeah.
So how is that different than, or how does that tie into research? Have I asked my question? I think I have.
Yes. Yeah, totally. Yeah, I went back and forth a lot about what to call the notes section at the end and what to include in it. And I ended up calling it works consulted because there are a bunch of things in that section that are never mentioned directly in the book itself, in the essays, right? So they're not works cited because I don't directly reference a lot of them, but they are the things that I was like reading and studying and thinking deeply about while writing the essays, right? So there are, I think, like 5 or 6 motherhood memoirs on that list that I read while writing the essay in the book called Mutual Mothering, about like mothering between friends and kind of trying to decide if I want to have a kid or not. And there was an earlier version of that essay that had another thread where I talked about all these books. But my writers group wisely was like, take all that out. You're just using these books to say the things you're already saying in the personal narrative. So I cut them from the essay, and I actually published that thread as its own thing at the offing, which was cool. I love salvaging the darlings. but I still wanted them in the works consulted because reading and thinking about those books was still like a very integral part of writing that essay.
So that actually just, I'm going to segue for a second because I was writing something today about the importance of reading while you're writing, and that counts.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
so how does that? I mean, so messages are piling up. So do you read and find inspiration? Do you have inspiration and look for words? How does your reading writing process work?
Yeah. I think of the books I read while writing as it being in two different categories. There's the stuff I'm reading for information and the stuff I'm reading for kind of stylistic possibility.
I'm sorry. What do you mean?
Like, so okay, so I wrote two essays for the book early, like they were the sample chapters in the proposal. Um, and then we sold the book, and then I had hip surgery. And so I was stuck in bed for 3 months. And I was like, I'm not going to start writing this book while I'm in bed, strapped to this crazy ice machine and like can't move. And I want to sit at my desk. I want to write my book, So I intentionally was like, I'm not going to start writing yet, but I'm going to read a lot. And I read a bunch of stuff. I was reading mostly, I decided that the first essay I was going to write afterwards was Sad Girls, the one I mentioned that has Janis Joplin and Sylvia Plath in it. And so I read The Red Comet, which is this like huge doorstop biography of Sylvia Plath. I read Janet Malcolm, The Silent Woman. I read this big biography of Janis Joplin. I read something else I can't remember, but I just was reading for information and making notes of like things that I might want to reference, putting little tabs in the book, etc. And then when I sat down to write that essay finally, when I was allowed to sit up, it just like came pouring out because I had stored up all this stuff, and had been thinking about it subconsciously while lying in bed and watching Jurassic Park and recovering from surgery. So there's that. And then I also kind of, as I was going, reread several of my favorite essay collections more for like to set a bar for myself, and to remember kind of what's possible stylistically. You're gonna ask me what they were. Yeah.
Oh, like put it in the chat, Lily, or like what do you, yes.
Yeah. So I read Girlhood by Melissa Febos, which had just come out. But it was like so perfectly exactly what I needed. It came out like right when I was at the beginning of writing this book, and then I reread it again when I was kind of in the midst of writing the essays. She's like the master of braided essays, I think, speaking of that form. Also How to Write an Autobiographical Novel by Alex Chi, The Crane Wife by CJ Hauser, White Magic by Alyssa Washuda. So those are a bunch of like recent ones that were favorites. But then I also was like, okay, let me also read like some Susan Sontag and George Orwell and James Baldwin, and like let me make sure that I'm not just being influenced by the present,
Interesting.
kind of remember to have a deeper bench than just your contemporaries, even though I'm very inspired by many of my contemporaries. And like so I said, when I set out to write a flash essay, having never done it before, I ordered the Best of Brevity anthology, and there's also a Rose Metal Press anthology of flash. And so I read both of those through kind of quickly once and just like dog-eared the bottoms of the pages of the flash essays that I liked without thinking much about why I liked them. Just like read one, cool, yes. Read one, skip it. Read one, loved it, etc. And then I went back again and read just those ones that I had dog-eared. So I kind of made a condensed, edited selection for myself of ones that I liked, and read through them again more slowly, thinking critically about like, okay, what do these all have in common? What makes a flash essay something that I like? you know, and started kind of coming up with my own like theory of what I wanted the flash essays to do. So that's what I mean. Like, you know, there's stuff that I read for kind of style, and then stuff that I read for research information, you know. And like with the true crime essay, I think that might be the one that I read the most for. With that one, I was like, okay, well, if I'm going to talk about true crime and talk about like the issues that I take with the genre, I have to really understand the genre and its conventions, and I have to understand those problems and how they work and where they originated. So I was like, okay, let me start with In Cold Blood.
Right.
You know, I read Helter Skelter and The Stranger Beside Me, and I'll Be There in the Dark, and you know, all this. I did a lot of like background reading for that one that I think there's like a couple paragraphs about in the in the final essay, but yeah.
So, all right, chat people, I'll get to you after my next comment, which is, so it sounds to me as though process-wise, you have, you kind of know where you want, you have the framework before you sit down?
Sometimes I just have like I want to write about this thing. I don't always know what I want to say about the thing yet. But usually I have like a direction of where I think it might go. And then it's in reading and writing and figuring it out that I kind of hone the specific you know, destination of an essay.
So I think that I realized the question that I was asking that I didn't ask that I want to ask is, so you did all that reading for the true crime essay. So how did that work sort of time-wise when you're writing and reading? That's a lot of reading for you know, 2,000 word, however long.
Yeah. Yes. um yeah, I mean, so I ended up budgeting my time, you know, like writing, having sold the book on proposal was great in a lot of ways, but also meant I had a limited amount of time. You know, I had deadlines to work with. And so I budgeted time depending on like how much reading I thought specific essays were going to need, how like complicated and thorny I thought they might be, how clear I was on what I wanted them to be, you know. So for that true crime essay, I think I gave myself 2 months, and the first, at least the first month, maybe more, was reading and making notes and kind of starting to jot down ideas, but not really sitting down to write until at least like the second half of that time.
Interesting. I'm going to jump to Ron's question, which is tangentially related. So, and thank you for all the caps in the question. So writers are often pushed toward memoir by publishers, which I don't know if that's true, but maybe it is.
It totally is. I knew that's
Okay.
why I said don't call it a memoir, because I knew that's like they
So
want to call it a memoir whenever they can.
I would like you to speak to that first because I didn't know that. And the second part is, did you get pushback when you tried to sell the book as a collection of essays? Because you already have, you know, a following.
I mean,
You have me. You have me. I'm your following.
I did so yes, part of this like theoretical craft essay about memoir and essays and essay collections and memoirs and essays that I want to write someday when I have 5 minutes is this like, why do publishers think that calling it a memoir is preferential? But I personally know several writers who wrote an essay collection that then was published with the subtitle a memoir, because for whatever reason publishers tend to think that's more sellable. I don't know. And I think in some cases it's fine and it doesn't really make that much of a difference, but in some cases it really feels like a disservice to the book, because then if you go into it and you're expecting a memoir, and you're expecting a certain amount of kind of narrative continuity, I think, you know, and then you get these discrete separate pieces. and they're not the same thing. I don't think those labels are interchangeable, even though they are very closely related and sometimes interchangeable. um I didn't get pushback. I mean, I have a really amazing agent who never tries to talk me out of or into anything that she knows I'm set on, and from the very beginning of when I started talking to her about this project, it was always an essay collection. And so that's the way we pitched it, and that's the way we sold it. Stop. Sorry, cat distraction. Yeah. And yeah, but then of course, yeah, there's always conflicting feedback. We got some rejections that were basically like, I wish this was a memoir. I wish it was more personal. But then we
Okay.
got some, right. It's like, okay, well, whatever. Go, I don't know what to tell you. And then, but we also got some that were like, I wish this was more topical and researched and less personal. So, whatever. I wasn't going to change it for those whims. It was just about finding the place that wanted it as an essay collection.
So that's funny. That reminds me of a roommate I had in college who's an artist. And I remember when she was showing her work and someone said, I love that painting, but can you do it in blue?
No, thank you. Yeah.
So Elizabeth wants to know, how did you give yourself permission to be a writer, to see your story as important to bring to light?
I don't know. I was raised by artists, and I say this this is something I say a lot as like kind of a half a joke, but it really is true that it wasn't until I was like 10 years old that I learned there was such a thing as an adult who's not an artist. That just was like,
It's
that's what
interesting.
you do. You live your life, you feed yourself, you have a job, maybe you have a family, and you make art. This is just like what it means to be human. So I'd never had to kind of decide that I was going to do that, and never felt like a big scary thing I had to give myself permission to do. It just is. Yeah.
So let's talk about your actual writing. So I found your writing very sensory, sensorious. So like, for instance, you've got cigarette smoke, you've got whiskey drinking, you've got singing, scream singing, stomping of combat boots. To me, I felt a lot of the sensations that I thought you wanted to get across. Was that magic? Was that intentional? Is that a thing you think about when you write?
For sure. Yeah. Yeah, that's always, I think there's a layer, in my initial drafts are very dry and very like, this happened, then this happened, and here's a moment where this happened, and I thought this about it, and here's what I want to say, and then in revision, I go back and kind of find the moments to crack open and invite people inside of. And I think for me, a lot of times the strongest memories are the ones that are very sensory. It's not just like a thing that you happened, right? It's a moment that you can step back into. And so I try to recreate that feeling on the page as much as possible.
So that's interesting. That puts me at two different. And please throw your questions in, but I have my own. So that puts me in two different directions. One is the question of the reliability of memory, or not reliability, or the reliability question mark of memory, and then the other fork, a very different one, which is not emotionally but professionally. How did you handle the fact that there were people that you knew that were gonna, even if you change the names, were gonna see themselves on the page? So very different questions, but
Yeah, well, no, I think those are really related questions, because it's the people in your life who are going to read it who are going to push back if you take too many liberties with memory, right? But I don't know. I mean, I showed the essays to everybody in the book
Oh, you did? Okay.
while editing, with various degrees of, not everybody got the same kind of level of input, but I mostly asked them at least like, how does this look to you, or is there anything in here that you really don't want to put in the public arena? But there were also some that was like, am I forgetting anything important? Did I leave out anything essential? Does this feel true to you? And there was one great example is there's this flash essay about my friend Sydney, who was sent away to boarding school, kind of like wasn't boarding school, it's like one of those schools for troubled children that Paris Hilton's now trying to get shut down. And she decided to run away, and a bunch of us met her bus at Port Authority when she was running away, and we got stopped by the cops, and she got brought right back, and we got put into a little room. And I write in the essay, I write about getting pulled away from her, like before I was sure that she had seen us, and wanting her to know that we had been there for her. And I sent her that piece, like, are you okay with this being in the world? Does this feel true to you, etc., all those questions. And she was like, I remember us being put into the little room together, and we were sitting there and like waiting. And I was like, really? And I was like, that can't be right. But she remembered a joke. She was like, yeah, I remember the cops told you that you couldn't leave until your mom came to pick you up, and you just cracked up because my mom was not very reliable. She was not going to come and pick me up. And I was like, yeah, that sounds like that totally could have happened, but she remembered it completely differently. But she told me this, and she was like, but you should keep it how it is, because the point, the thing that you're saying is what's important, and it's great, and I love it, and leave it alone. And so it's like, okay, cool.
So that is so interesting, because so my grandmother died decades ago, and there were a couple of people alive who still remembered the night that she died. And a couple of years ago, we all got on the phone together to talk about this memory, and everybody had a different memory of who was there, who said what, and no one is lying.
Yeah,
Everyone
exactly.
is telling the truth. But I was like, no, you were there. And my sister said, I was not. I was here. So that's a very I didn't put it in writing.
Yeah.
So yeah, memory is we've got lots of people interested in the discrepancies of memory.
Yeah.
So we are running low on time, which is unfortunate. So and yeah, I mean, it is. I would like to have a craft chat just on how unreliable memory is, and how fluid. Okay, so are there, Lauren wants to know, are there any publishers or presses you recommend for baby essayists? I'm guessing, Lauren, that you're looking to publish? So
I don't know, I don't know. Well, first of all, I mean, like individual essays or presses.
Lauren, if you want to put a bit more into the chat about what you're looking for, we will jump back to that. In the meantime, I'm going to ask you what your writing life is like. So, Lauren, I'm keeping an eye out, but what is your, there's 1,000 Words a Summer, 5 a.m. Writers. What is your writing practice like?
Yeah, I do not, I've never been a like write every day writer, or a like word count goals writer. For me, it's more about setting aside the time to engage with the work, and sometimes that just means like the time to not be busy with other stuff. So I set aside like chunks of writing time. In an ideal world, like right when I was working on this book and like had an advance paying some of the bills, that was like 3 days a week, 3 sequential days. so I could like really wade out into the depths. But sometimes it's one day a week, sometimes it's every other week, whatever, whatever it is. But I highlight them in pink on my planner, and it's like that time is not available for anything else. And then that doesn't mean I'm writing that whole time. Sometimes that means I'm lying in bed reading. Sometimes that means I go take a walk in the park. Sometimes it means I lie on the floor and think about the thing I'm gonna write. It's just about like being engaged with the work. And I've learned finally, after like years of berating myself, that if I sit down to write and nothing is coming out, and I'm feeling tired and demoralized and just don't feel like it, trying to push through that is not going to get me anywhere. That means I'm tired and depleted and not inspired. And the most productive thing I can do at that point is stop trying and just have some creative input instead. And maybe usually that means reading. Sometimes it means going to a museum. Sometimes it means like going and seeing my friends and feeling like refreshed as a human being. And that all counts. That all counts as writing.
It does. And I wrote something today about like writing as the phases of the moon, right? Sometimes there's no moon, sometimes there's a shining moon. The moon will still be there. There's probably a good moon joke in there. So okay. So a couple of questions as we're wrapping up about okay, so Lauren is back. So Lauren and Jackie want to know about how to get started publishing personal essays. Are there good sites for that? Do you suggest starting with individual pieces or try for collection? And do they have to have a current hook into current event? There, I put you all together.
Okay. I mean, yeah, I think if you're just getting started, I would definitely say write some individual essays first, rather than starting with a book, just because it takes some time. It takes a lot of essays to learn how to write essays. And also, for practical purposes, it's a lot easier to sell a book if you have some publications already. No, you definitely do not need a hook for current events or pop culture. There are specific publications that do need a hook, right? Like if you're trying to sell a personal essay to a newspaper's op-ed section, for example, then yes, it has to be connected to something that's happening in the news right now, and you have to turn it around pretty quickly, and you have to explain why it's relevant. But there's a whole world of like lit journals and publications that want more literary work that it would be impossible to write timely pieces for because they move very slowly.
Yes, they do.
And so you would be defeating yourself trying to send a timely piece to a publication that's going to get back to you a year later, when the piece is totally stale. Yeah, as for specific places, I would say, you just have to read a ton and see which places are publishing work that you like, and read more widely than just like the New Yorker and the Paris Review and the New York Times. Fine, like, sure, yeah, they publish great stuff sometimes and also some garbage sometimes. But find the smaller outlets that are publishing stuff you like and become super readers of those places. I think, I always, that question of like, well, where should we publish sounds like a simple question, but it's really a deceptive question that I don't think anybody else can actually answer for you, because where you should publish depends on what you're writing, depends on what your taste is and what your goals are and what your style is and what kind of writer you want to be and what kind of publications you want to be in. And so I think figuring that out for yourself through reading is a big part of the job of being a writer, right? You get better, your craft gets better, your work gets better, but you also have a more kind of defined idea of where in this ecosystem you belong.
So I will give one writer center piece of advice about that. I agree with all that, but one writer center piece of advice is I'm going to put my email in the chat and I can talk to you about like the process of publishing, but also remember, simultaneous submissions are your friend. You don't have to wait a year to get a response. You need to say this is a simultaneous submission, which means that if you get accepted, you'll pull it away from other places. So just, I see questions that make me think about that. So Lilly, as my last question for the night, what is one piece of advice you have for writers just starting out?
I mean, yeah, I think that just read a shit ton, and figure out your own tastes. I think getting to the point, there was a big light bulb moment for me, I think, when I switched from, if I read something and I didn't like it, I assumed that I didn't get it.
Hmm.
When I was first starting out, and now I understand, like, no, I just don't like it. That doesn't mean it's bad, right? Sometimes that's important too, right? Just because you don't like something doesn't mean it's trash. But I think honing your own taste and becoming confident in your own taste is a really important part of getting better as a writer.
And that's a wrap, people. Lilly, thank you so much.
Thank
Please
you.
buy the book. And when you get to, I put my email in the craft chat. When you get to the last line of the book and you don't know whether to laugh, cry, or deal with the goosebumps in your arms, send me an email. Be like, I know.